Okay, so we're going to talk about the post-war economic boom. So we're talking about the time period after World War II, including the 1950s. This is probably regarded as the greatest expansion of the American economy. Um, and this is where the United States really kind of became a world economic power. It kind of begins in 1946 at the end of the war with the passage of the GI Bill, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. And this is a law that gave help to returning soldiers. They got low interest loans to buy homes. They got to go to college for free. And so it really gave people an economic opportunity because they were able to get better jobs because they had college degrees. They were able to afford houses and become more stable economically. So in this kind of 1950s decade, which is kind of what we're looking at here, one of the things that we have is kind of this building of infrastructure and movement west. So people begin to move west to what's called the Sun Belt. And you have, during this time, you have the first highways being built. So the federal interstate highway system, which was the Federal Highway Act, which Eisenhower supported. Because it was he saw a highway system like this when he was in Germany in World War II, and so he thought that was a good idea. So as president, he supported federal funding for this Federal Highway Act, and so now families could travel from state to state in their car on vacations along the highway system. Also include the transportation of goods. So if you ever saw the movie Cars, Radiator Springs is on the old road, and then the new highway built next door causes Radiator Springs to die off. So that's one of the downsides of the highway system. Some of these smaller towns where roadside stops kind of die off and the highway system bypasses them. But this also provides a highway for people to move west to the Sun Belt. And the West has a really strong growing economy because of military contracts. NSC 68 was a government document, a memo which was recommended that for the Cold War, the United States should increase its military spending. And a lot of that spending came out west because you had a lot of defense contractors out there, aerospace and that sort of thing, especially in Southern California. The West is also attractive to people because it had warm weather. And the development of air conditioning made it possible to settle in places like Florida and Texas and be comfortable year round. Okay, so when we talk about the West and the Sun Belt, we talk about California, Texas, those kinds of places. So during the 1950s, this post-war economic boom, there's also movement from the urban areas into the suburbs, right? So the baby boom is occurring at this time, which means rapid population growth, young population. You have more families, and so they're moving to suburbs where they can afford, people can buy houses outside the city, and they have that kind of lifestyle of having a yard and a decent sized house, a couple of cars in the driveway. So the GI Bill is really kind of helpful for that. And one of the first examples of a suburb is Levittown. These homes are all identical. They're all the same, but they are affordable, and it creates these suburban white neighborhoods. Okay. Work-wise, people were doing well. Unions were having increases in membership. There was less strikes. The two biggest unions, the AFL and the CIO, they merged together. And you have what's called this post-war contract, where essentially workers are getting more benefits, higher wages from the companies. And the unspoken agreement is that those unions won't go on strike or won't have any kind of labor strife. So this post-war contract is kind of like, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and the workers kind of benefit. They end up with good pay. They're able to make a good living, support their family, buy houses, all that kind of stuff. Okay, culture-wise, you have the consumer culture really develops in the 1950s. The TV, with ads on TV, there's TV shows. You have credit cards. People are able to kind of borrow money on credit cards and then pay them off. But because wages are good, you don't have the debt problems like you had in the 1920s. So this consumer culture really kind of takes hold. You have new youth culture as well, rock and roll. Elvis Presley and the youth kind of are this teenage rebellion against kind of this suburban kind of lifestyle that is kind of occurring as well. You have new kinds of technology, the space program. Again, this is the aerospace industry that's out west. The Mercury and Apollo space programs, the development of the hydrogen bomb, intercontinental ballistic missiles, You have the first kind of computers. It's UNIVAC was one of the first computers that kind of was programmed and was able to predict the results of the 52 election. You have the medical advances like the vaccine for polio. So this is a time of advancement in the United States, and a lot of the country is benefiting pretty strongly from this. However, there are some significant contradictory characteristics. This is a return to traditional gender roles. Remember, women were working in factories during World War II, and they kind of stepped back and became kind of more traditional housewives and took care of the household and that sort of thing. Part of that is because of the baby boom is going on, so you have this huge growth in young children. There's also some corruption in unions, and there's unions never really kind of take hold in the South. Unions kind of are mostly in the urban areas of the North and West, and then unions are kind of corrupt. There's associations with the mafia and that sort of thing. There is While there's this growth in the suburbs and the affluence and the wealth of the suburbs is growing, what's happening is you have poverty in the inner cities. It's called white flight. Basically, white middle class people are leaving the city to move to the suburbs, leaving behind a poor non-white population in the cities. And so the kind of cities are being hollowed out with some of the wealth. Another contradictory characteristic is the launch of Sputnik, where this is part of the space race. Is part of the reason why the United States developed the Mercury and Apollo space program, because the Soviet Union was the first to launch a satellite, and so there's competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was significant and led the country to believe that the U.S. was falling behind in the space race. Also, for non-white people, this post-war economic boom was not always felt by them. I mentioned African Americans in particular were kind of living in the inner cities as a result of white flight. But you also have these migrant farm workers that were Mexican American and Asian Americans. Their conditions were very poor, wages were very poor. So when we talk about this post-war economic boom, we're talking about mostly felt by middle-class white people, and there are certainly groups that were left out of of this post-war boom, particularly non-white groups. And also, you can maybe argue women because they don't have the same economic opportunities that they had during wartime. So this post-war economic boom is the 1950s. It's kind of a time period where there was a lot of economic growth, a lot of movement, and a lot of optimism for the country as well.